This week's text is the famous Doubting Thomas story, where Thomas was not present with the rest of the disciples who saw Jesus's resurrected body last week. And so this week, they're all telling him, "You won't believe it, Jesus is back from the dead." And Thomas says probably what most of us would. Well, I'm not going to believe it until I can actually, see his crucifixion wounds, right? No, it's really him. And touch him, make sure he's not just like a ghost. Now, if you've heard about Doubting Thomas, you know that he's been stigmatized for doubting this way. In fact, when we call someone a Doubting Thomas, it's basically never a compliment. I know, particularly in religious circles, those of us who are prone to asking questions are often villainized, demonized, stigmatized as Doubting Thomases, and doubts are treated as something bad. Well, here at the Haven Collective, that's not how we like to approach doubts and questions. In fact, we think that they're an essential part of our spiritual growth. And so I want to look a little bit closer at this interaction between Thomas and Jesus, because I think there's actually more here than the idea that his doubts are somehow treated as bad. First of all, I think it's worth noting that Thomas doesn't ask for anything more than the other disciples actually got. It's not like the rest of them all believed because they heard the report from Mary Magdalene. No, even after Mary went and told them, they were hiding in a room and afraid. And it wasn't until Jesus appeared to them and showed them his wounds that they believed. So if we're going to stigmatize Thomas, we have to stigmatize the rest of the disciples as well. Also, the other thing is, it's so fascinating to me that what Thomas says he will require for proof that it's really Jesus is the crucifixion wounds themselves. Because before Jesus's death, the proof that he was who he said he was his miracles, his amazing signs, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, casting out demons, all this kind of stuff. But after, it's these wounds, it's these literal openings in his body that represent not his amazing power or his miraculous abilities, but his vulnerability. The fact that he was killed instead of conquering, right? That's the proof of his vulnerability. And so that's what I want to talk about in our beacons this week. What does it look like for us to be vulnerable? How does that vulnerability help us get unstuck in our relationships, in our jobs, in our world? And so rather than me talking about it, I wanted to interview someone. That's one of the things we're going to do in these beacon teachings, is we're going to, in addition to highlighting other teachers from time to time, we're going to interview subject matter experts. And so we're going to sit down with our good friend, Dr. Phillip Ortiz, who is a counselor and a therapist. And we're going to talk to him about vulnerability, what it is, why it's so scary, and why we have such a hard time doing it. It's so good to have you back with us.
Thank you, JR. It's always nice to be here.
So we're talking about vulnerability today. And, vulnerability, I think, especially in relationships, is something that's really scary, but it's essential to deep relationships. So in your professional perspective, why is the risk of being vulnerable worth it?
Okay. Well, for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is, if you think about it, it's a wonderful indicator of emotional stability. When a person, is able to make themselves vulnerable, that, imbues confidence, and that says that they are able to effectively manage their emotions. The other key point behind the question is that it's really the other side of the coin of trust. So if you think about it, when you trust someone, you're able to really make yourself vulnerable to that person. But if you don't trust them, you're not going to be vulnerable. So it's really, if you think about it in relationships specifically, if a person says, hey, I love you, or this and that, I worry about you, but they're not willing to share that part of themselves or let you peek into the part of them to see them vulnerable, then that says they only trust you so much. They're only going to let you go so far. That's conditional. So like if you say you want to love somebody unconditionally, well, vulnerability is a big part of it. That's how we know we trust, each other. I mean, think about it, we even see that with animals. You look at my dogs. Whenever they meet strangers, I always tell them, hey, hold your hand open so they can see the inside of your palm, because for a dog, that shows that you are willing to make yourself vulnerable to them. Versus if you have your hand closed like this, it's more rough, it's more protective, you got bone here. So for an animal, that's more of an aggressive stance. Same thing when a dog lays down and shows their belly to get a belly rub, that's them making themselves vulnerable because the belly is the most vulnerable part of their body. So for many creatures, it's almost instinctual. But for we as humans, we hesitate sometimes. So I think in order to really bridge the gap, if you really want to know if someone trusts you, or if you really want to allow, if you want to be trusted by other people, you got to make yourself vulnerable. It's kind of like it's part of it's the package deal, man. You can't get complete trust without vulnerability. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's from a more psychological
It
perspective.
absolutely no, it absolutely makes sense. And I think an important follow-up question to that is how do you know when it's time to risk being vulnerable? Because I think we've all had the experience, maybe part of why we're so scared to be vulnerable is that we've taken that risk, we've been vulnerable with someone, and it turned out they were not worthy of that trust, right? And they used that vulnerability to harm us or to exploit us or something like that. So are there ways that we can know when it's time to make that risk to put ourselves out there?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In my mind, I equate that to like, when I teach anger management, especially the angry juveniles. I teach this all the time, and I tell them, think about it. Anger, for the equation, it works really well because anger, I always ask them, hey, was it bad or good? Well, it's neither. It's just an emotion, right? Now, when you go and you do stuff like you go and you get in a fight, you punch somebody, that's an assault charge. That'll get you in trouble, right? Love, same thing. Love and emotion can make you do good or bad things. Well, when you think about vulnerability and level of trust, you don't want to go at it prematurely. Like you don't want to just make yourself vulnerable to the first person you meet or everybody, or the first person is, oh, I like your hair. Oh, and then you make yourself vulnerable. No, no, that's premature. Really, I'd say an indicator is when you get to a point where you spend some time with somebody and you want to go to the next level. You want a deeper connection with this individual where you want them to know that you trust them. But at the same time, it works. It goes both ways. You don't want to give the trust prematurely, or you do it. It's like when they say, "Oh, you have to earn the trust." Well, there's a reason why, because again, you're right. There are some people that will take advantage of the situation. So I'd say look for the indicator I would look for is when you feel that it's an equally balanced relationship. It's a give and take. I told my daughter the other day, you're gonna meet people, they're gonna come and go. But hey, just because someone says they're your friend, that doesn't mean they're your friend. You decide if you want them to be your friend. So, and it really, it should not be difficult because she's, oh my gosh, these friends of mine, they're so difficult. It's like, well, why are they your friends? A friendship shouldn't be that difficult. It should be, more smooth, and it should be equally balanced, give and take, give and take. So when you feel that you have found someone that you believe is worthy of your trust, then you start. And I would say, don't make, and again, remember, there are various degrees of vulnerability. You don't go with the top and talk about maybe an, or, repressed childhood abusive experience. You start with something small, see how the person handles that. And then you continue to move deeper and deeper and deeper, which then solidifies the commitment of the relationship. Ideally, when you think about it, or at least that's how I think about it from a human relations standpoint.
I love that. So I think in our culture, it's especially hard for men to be vulnerable. Why is that? And what do you think men especially need to know about the choice to be vulnerable?
Okay, well, there's a scientific explanation. There's a short answer. The short answer is men are dumb. We just do dumb things, all right. But the more scientific explanation is really it comes back to how we're socialized. You see, you think about it, with vulnerability, trust, and love, these, are really more of learned behaviors. So you have to go back in time. You got to travel back in time and look at, okay, what did your family of origin teach you about vulnerability and trust? What did the people who were around you, your social network, your social circle, what did they teach about vulnerability? Most guys, and I'm not going to say this is guys, because I've seen this happen with women too. Women can be the same way, but it's more pronounced, I believe, with men, where it's just more common. We're socialized to be, oh, you got to be tough, man. And we view vulnerability as a sign of weakness, because we're almost programmed. Oh, well, I got to be the protector of my family. I got to be the protector of my partner. I got to be strong. But vulnerability doesn't imply a weakness, you know. And so we have to change that equation. It's almost like, a mental breakthrough. I think like I reflect, growing up as a kid, my father, he never once ever apologized to me for anything, good or bad, just never did. All right. And it always kind of bothered me. I was like, wonder why it's so hard for this guy to apologize. I mean, he's a great guy, I love him to death, but I just noticed he never did that. Now, for me personally, I make it a point when I feel or it's coming or it's pointed out to me that I've done something wrong or something I shouldn't or reacted in a way I shouldn't. I don't hesitate to apologize to my kids or other people so that I know that, hey, I've put it out there. Because again, doing an apology, that's a sign of a vulnerability because you're willing to admit, hey, you know what, I was wrong, I messed up, I could have done this better, I didn't, that wasn't your fault, that was on me, that was my fault. I'm taking responsibility. So it's the small steps like that. And I think, it's part of changing the program to say, like, oh, well, the guy, I can't cry. Well, why not? It's a human reaction. We literally have human physiology, tear ducts in our eyes that are made to do that. So why can't we do it? No, we just don't want to do it because we perceive it as a sign of weakness. And unfortunately, that can become a barrier in relationships because when you are unable to allow a person to see that vulnerable side of you, then again, it's like you're putting up a barrier. So they're only going to get to know so much of you. So I think for us as men, it's really more of reprogramming ourselves to say, okay, you know what? Just because I allow someone to see my vulnerable side, that doesn't make me any less of a guy, any less of a man. That doesn't make me any weaker, softer. No, it actually makes you stronger because when the reality is you have the guts and the courage to let someone see that side of you, that you're not afraid to show that to the right person, to appropriate people. So that's where, like, even, like as I mentioned, I worked with a lot of, juveniles on probation. And I always tell them, hey, you may not want to admit it, but you know what? You got feelings. They are there. You're human, you're going to have them, all right? The problem is you don't know how to manage them effectively. You don't know how to keep them balanced. You don't know how to regulate them. You don't know how to properly display them. So that's the problem. It's the programming that's wrong. We have to change the programming. If we change the programming, then we're going to have better outcomes. So if you think about it, I see this all the time when I've done couples work. A lot of times people think, well, they should know how I feel. I was like, well, they're not psychic. If you don't tell them, you don't talk about what's going on, then your partner, your spouse, or your kids, whoever, they're not gonna know what you're dealing with. So the key point is you gotta vocalize it. You gotta say it. You gotta put it out there. That's how you begin to process. And it's not gonna come natural. If you've never done this before, it's gonna take some time. So you start with small little baby steps. Start with small baby steps. And let the other person get to know you if you want to have that deeper connection and if you really want to if you really trust them, because you can say, oh, I trust you, but if you're not making yourself vulnerable, you don't really trust them, or you only trust them somewhat. It's conditional trust. Okay, I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of the way I think those are my perspectives, both as being a man and being a professional. That's kind of what I see.
Dr. Phillip Ortiz, as always, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you. And again, just to hear how you break down some of these really important issues. So thanks again for joining us.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you, JR. Anytime, man. Anytime. All right. Have a nice one.
I really appreciated how Phil talked about the way we stigmatize vulnerability in our culture. It's something that we treat as dangerous. It's something we treat as scary. It's something that we treat as weak. And we see the same things happening to Thomas, right? By being called a doubting Thomas, by him saying that his own desire for proof of Jesus's crucified and resurrected body are somehow dangerous or weak or some kind of a lack of faith. But what Jesus does in the face of Thomas's warranted skepticism is invite Thomas into his vulnerability, invite Thomas into his open body. I mean, literally, he invites Thomas to stick. I mean, it's a little gross, right? But stick his hand inside the spear wound in his side, which, that's gross. But that's what Thomas is invited to do. And I think there's a really powerful metaphor there because, as you probably heard, the Apostle Paul calls the church the body of Christ. And if we understand the idea that the answer to doubt and to skepticism and to questions is not certitude and not power and not signs, but rather an openness and a vulnerability, we find that it can be actually at the very sites of our weakness and our reliance on God that people come to join what we're doing. So that's what I want to talk about in our beacons this week. How can we choose to be vulnerable? Where do we need to choose to be vulnerable? And how can our very choice to be vulnerable be an invitation to those in our lives?